In the variables recording, I mentioned that the variables are what the researcher is interested in. The population is who they're interested in. Population is the term we use to refer to the group of people, situations, or things who are of interest to the researchers. In psychology research, it's usually people, so I'll use the wording for that type of population. Depending on the topic and the researcher's focus, the population can be large, like people in general, which would imply people all over the world. It could also be a smaller group, like American college students, or individuals with a particular mental health diagnosis, or people with a particular occupation. In many cases, though, it's not practical or possible to gather data from everyone in the population. So researchers use what's called a sample of people. In other words, they use a smaller group of people who are members of the population of interest. The sample is the people, group, or objects who participated in the research. For example, if researchers are interested in American college students, they could ask a few hundred students to participate in the research. The concern when using a sample to represent the population relates to what we call representativeness. In the last slide, I gave the example of using a sample of a few hundred college students to represent a sample of all American college students. You might have found yourself questioning that, questioning whether a few hundred students could really represent all college students. You were questioning the representativeness of the research and doing a great job of practicing savvy skepticism. Have you ever heard the phrase, "That's like comparing apples to oranges"? In some cases, questioning representativeness is more like asking whether a golden delicious apple really represents all apples. Though we'll see some studies that almost seem like comparing apples to oranges. Thinking about an example might help clarify the difference between the population and the sample. You might remember this study from the recording about variables. A sample is the group of people who participate in the study. So in this case, it was 127 couples. The N equals before the number 127 is an abbreviation for the number equals. But what is the population of interest? Sometimes the title or the abstract will say it directly, but often it's only implied. For this study, one clue is that the title refers to couples' dyadic coping conversations, and couples is possessive. So the title means that they're interested in conversations that take place between people and couples. Then, the first sentence refers to well-functioning relationship, which adds to the emphasis on couples. The final sentence explains that the findings have implications for interventions with couples. Collectively, that suggests the population of interest is people in couples. Both quantitative and qualitative research have a population of interest. The approach to sampling tends to be different, though. Quantitative research tends to use larger samples, which makes sense given that they're typically collecting numeric data that's more efficient to gather and analyze. The statistical analysis process also makes the sample size important, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Qualitative studies tend to use smaller samples, in part because the emphasis on detailed understanding makes data collection and analysis more time-consuming. In some cases, though, a researcher might be able to gather data from every member of the population. I'll explain more about that in the recording about research designs. The process of recruiting participants, referred to as sampling, can influence the degree to which the sample represents the population. One approach is to use what's called probability sampling, sometimes also called simple random sampling. The synonyms for probability include likelihood and chance, which helps give an idea of what probability sampling is. A process of recruiting participants that creates an equal likelihood or equal chance of everyone being included in the sample. It's like a lotto drawing where each ball has an equal chance of being drawn, only with sampling it's usually with people. A probability sample is the ideal approach for addressing concerns about representativeness, but it's not very common. Going through an example will probably help you understand why. To use probability sampling, the researcher has to be able to contact every member of the population. If our population of interest is American college students, do you think it'd be easy to contact every student in the country? It'd probably be tricky, but possible. The researcher would have to find a list of all the four-year colleges and community colleges in the country. The kind of list is available because of the various accreditation requirements. It's not the last step, though. They would also need to contact someone at every school to request a list of email addresses or request an email be forwarded to a group of students. At this point, you might be questioning whether that's practical, and we aren't even talking about a sample to represent people in general. It might be possible in some cases, but it's much more practical if the study only needs participants to respond to surveys. When the operational definition requires researchers to interact with participants, which includes the large majority of the qualitative studies, it's pretty tricky to select a probability sample. Indeed, many researchers find it's not practical to use probability sampling, so they use one of the techniques that's referred to as non-probability sampling. That simply means some members of the population are more likely to be included in that than others. That also means we have to think about the representativeness when we're thinking about what we know based on the findings of a research study. The most common approach to sampling is a non-probability technique called convenience sampling. That's when the researcher asks individuals who happen to be nearby if they'll participate in the study. You'll see a lot of studies in psychology that use a sample of students in introductory psychology class, which is a convenient sample. I'm going to take a brief detour to emphasize something about terminology and word use. The word random isn't unique to research or to sampling methods, so it's important to make sure we're thinking of it accurately. Anytime you use or see the word random in the context of research, it's referring to equal likelihood. So if a researcher indicates they're interested in understanding American college students, and they recruited participants by standing at, quote, random locations on a college campus to ask students to participate, that would not be an accurate use of random because it doesn't give all students on that campus an equal likelihood of being asked to participate, let alone all American college students. So why do we care about population and sampling? From the perspective of a researcher, the population is the group they're interested in, so they're probably thinking about the population as much as they think about the variables when they're in the early stages of the research process. As you've probably gathered from what I said earlier about representativeness, the sampling process influences the applicability of the findings. It influences the degree to which the study really adds to our knowledge about the population the researcher is interested in. As a consumer of research, we need to ask whether the sample is representative of the population. If we think not so much, it doesn't mean that we want to completely dismiss the results as being meaningless. We just need to be more tentative in the claims that we make based on those results. That goes along with why it matters when we practice savvy skepticism. When we hear a claim, when someone says, "This is how it is," we want to ask who they're interested in, who the information supposedly applies to, and who the evidence is based on. In some cases, you might realize that the evidence appears to be based on their own personal experiences, which suggests the claim is unsubstantiated, or at least based on assumptions that probably limit the actual applicability. You can probably think of some situations where someone who had a different life experience than you, really different, tried to tell you something about how your life should be. In addition to being based on some faulty assumptions, it just doesn't make sense. Each of those considerations also introduces another way to explain the evidence that was used to develop the claim, when there is evidence.